go ahead and get started. And if people pop in, that's fine. Kind of a couple quick things. If you just happened to pop on just a moment ago, feel free to leave your camera off if you want, or turn it on. Either way, it's up to you. If you are muted, that's fine, but you don't need to be muted. Just make sure there's no background noise so that it doesn't kind of cut into the audio for other people. And then if you have any questions throughout the time of the CEU, try to utilize unmuting and just asking it rather than utilizing the chat box, just because it's a little hard for me to see the PowerPoint and the chat at the same time. And since I'm leading the CEU, I don't want to miss any questions. We'll also try to give chances throughout the the training to kind of ask questions, but if you have one that comes up, just feel free to throw it out. If you are on here and your Zoom account is your CASA name, you'll be good. We'll automatically get you the credit marked down. After this CEU is over, I will send out an email. It will have a feedback form. We'd love to hear your feedback, especially since this could be a training that would kind of evolve in the future. And I will also send out the PowerPoint. And then finally, just note that this Zoom is being recorded. So if you need to share it with another CASA friend, or if you want to go back and refer to it, it will be on our website. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. Everyone can see my screen, correct? Yep, we're good. Okay, if not, holler. So today we're going to be talking about IEPs, 504s, and looking into special education. And just right off the bat, this can be a very evolved topic. We could do an entire day training on this. So this is just to give you the basics of what IEPs are, the process, 504s, that kind of thing. But if you have further questions, I can point you in the right direction. I might be able to answer questions. Our kind of co-presenter, Cindy Matherly, might be able to answer questions. I can get those questions to her and we can kind of correspond via email. So just know that if we don't touch on a topic today, or you have something that's case specific, you can connect with us and we can try to point you in the right direction. So most of you may know me, or I feel like I know at least most of your all's names if I haven't met you all in person. But my name is Liz Matherly. I am a former volunteer manager and recently transitioned into being the CASA of Lexington Training and Events Coordinator. So if you haven't gotten a chance to chat more frequently, hopefully you'll see me around when you attend more CEUs. I'm also, for those of you that don't know, a former elementary school teacher. I taught 3rd and 4th grade in Jessamine County Public Schools, and I have a bachelor's in elementary education. And my co-facilitator today, let me see if I can, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties because I'm trying to see how I can possibly see my notes and present. So give me one moment. I have never actually done this on Zoom before where I can see. There we go. Are you all able to see all of that now? Including all my notes and everything? Are you just
Yeah.
slides?
No, your screen shares on there with presenters, Liz, Cindy, all that stuff.
Do you see all the slides below too?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if that's okay with you guys, that way I don't forget any of my notes, and hopefully you guys can still see the larger piece as well. And then you'll just be able to read my notes as well. So like I said, my co-presenter today is Cindy Matherly. She is a retired school psychologist. She also happens to be my mother-in-law. So very lucky to have her, have married into her family. She is also worked in Jessamine County Public Schools for many, many years in the elementary and middle schools. And she is a former instructional resource consultant, which that's a term that varies from county to county, but basically that means that she was the ARC chairperson. So she has a lot of experience with writing IEPs, doing evaluations, and leading ARCs, which are all things that we're going to talk about today. So if those are acronyms that you're not familiar with, that's okay. We're going to chat through them. So today we're going to be talking about IEPs. IEPs stand for Individualized Education Programs. So specifically today, we're going to talk about how a child gets an IEP, the process of getting an IEP. There's multiple steps that a child has to go through before they are given an IEP. What an IEP includes. So as a CASA with your court order, you'll have access to IEPs, and you might feel like you don't understand what you're reading, or you don't know.
I do.
Yes? Sorry. Was there a question? Okay, sounds good. What IEPs include, so that way you'll kind of know what you're reading, and then specifically what ARC, or sometimes people call them ARC meetings, are. We're also going to talk a little bit today about 504s. So that is another type of special education document that you might have heard of, and you might even be like, what is the difference between a 504 and an IEP? We're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk about RTI and a little bit about ELL. One of the things I like to joke about is, just like working with the Cabinet for Health and Family Services and within the court system, there's lots of acronyms. Education's the exact same way. So hopefully we're going to explain some of those to you today. We're also going to talk a little bit about parents' rights, just because it's something that I think as CASAs, we need to be aware of, where the parent has rights in this educational process, and when they're going to be in the room. And then one of the things I hear a lot about with kind of working with the advocates I did when I was a volunteer manager is, we have kids that are transient, right? They move around from foster home to foster home or placement to placement. And what if those kids have an IEP? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and then finally how to advocate for students with IEPs and 504s. So and actually I'm going to jump out of this, and hopefully that will actually give you guys even more screen. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is what an IEP stands for. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. Okay, where did this even come from? IEPs are a written program for students with a disability who are eligible to receive special education and related services under IDEA. IDEA is a act, so we're getting into the legalese here. IDEA stands for, I'm going to jump down, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is a federal act, and it's under ADA, the American Disabilities Act. So IDEA is what helps us kind of give us guides of an IEP. So IEPs under the IDEA Act serve kids 3 through 21. So you might be thinking, they serve kids 3 through 21, but most kids are out of school, before they turn 21, and some kids don't enter school until they're like 4 or 5. So children younger than 3 can be served through First Steps. Some of you may be familiar with that. That is a system that serves really young children. They are served through something called IFSP, which is a individual family services plan. Once children reach the age of 3, they can qualify for preschool. And you might be familiar with this if you've had children or worked with CASA kids that are this young. Not everyone gets to attend public preschool. You have to qualify. And one of the ways that children qualify is through delays. And so if they are delayed, they might be able to start attending public preschool. And that's when they can start getting that IEP at 3 if they were to qualify. So that's why you might be like, wow, that's kind of young. On the flip side, going through age 21. So IEPs do not apply in college. If a child turns 18, goes to a college, every college is going to be a little bbit different. There are universities and colleges that do have accommodations that they can provide. So for example, my sister had ADHD or has ADHD, had an IEP, went to the University of Kentucky. They have an accommodations office, disabilities office, and they provided her accommodations that were similar to the IEPs she had in high school. What we mean though when we say 18, it goes all the way up to 21, is actually that certain children who have high needs, really high needs, right? Kind of those highest level of needs, are actually able to stay in public high school through the age of 21. These are going to be students who probably would never go to college, maybe never even live on their own. And so they're able to attend public high school through 21, and that IEP will stay with them through age 21. So if you have a CASA kid who is approaching 17, 18 years old, and also is a really, really high needs kiddo, then that might be something to kind of be aware of, that even though CASA might be done at 18, when the child legally becomes an adult, if they weren't to recommit to the cabinet and all those kind of nuances, one of the things that might help you kind of at least prepare the child to age out would be to see if they're going to stay in high school and if that IEP might follow them. So IEPs will describe the student's strengths and needs. They'll articulate measurable annual goals. They have specifically designed instruction, related services, supplementary aids, and services required to address the educational needs of the student. That's a lot of stuff. We're going to break each of those down today, but what that's basically saying is we're looking at what the student's needs are and goals that we can have them progress to, and how we're going to get them there. Just a quick side note, I didn't think we had any CASA cases like this, but I just kind of wanted to throw it out there that kids who are educated on military bases, so not children who are military families who are educated in public schools, but children who are actually educated on base, like at Fort Campbell, for example, IDEA does not cover those kids in the same way. They're actually covered through something called DODEA. It's Department of Defense Education Activities, and it's similar kind of stuff to an IEP, but it doesn't follow quite the same track. So just know that if for some reason that ever were to come up in a CASA case, it's going to possibly look a little different. So some of the big principles of IDEA that act that kind of guides IEPs. These are kind of the 6 big takeaways that I want you to think about when someone brings up IDEA. First of all, free appropriate public education. FAPE is what it can be called. FAPE is basically the idea of public schools, right? Every child in the United States has the access to public education. But really what the focus here for us today is it's free appropriate. So it's appropriate for each individual child. And if a child has a disability and needs an IEP, it still needs to be free to them. So the whole idea I want you to take away here is that IEPs don't cost anything. IEP evaluations shouldn't cost anything. In general, this is being provided by the school for the student who has a disability and needs accommodations to learn. Appropriate evaluations. We're going to talk a lot more about evaluations in a couple of slides because that's a big part of one of the steps of the process of getting an IEP. But this would be evaluations that are appropriate for that individual child, meaning they're not being evaluated for areas that they might not have a disability in. They're being evaluated for areas that they need to be evaluated in because they have a disability in that area. Obviously, the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, which is what we're here talking about today. Parent and student participation. So you're going to see me say this a couple of times. Parents are very involved in the IEP process. Parents are key planners in the creation of the IEP, and then also they have rights throughout this process. They have to give consent for certain things. Students, funny enough, also have a voice in their IEP. Specifically, we're going to talk about this when a child reaches either 8th grade or when they turn 14, whichever one comes first. And so kind of if you have any sort of older youth and you've had conversations about possibly what they want and if they're going to age out and thinking about if they want to go home or be adopted, and those kind of larger conversations where we start to really push our youth who are teenagers to start maybe self-advocating, similar concept. They really want to have youth in the room. And so those 8th graders, those 14-year-olds are encouraged to be in the room, and they need to be in the room to self-advocate about what they want to do, where they want to see themselves going, so that transitional services can possibly be provided in their IEP so that they can meet those long-term goals, like maybe going to college or a trade school. Least restrictive environment. This means that children are going to be placed where it is best for their learning, but also as inclusive as possible. So gone are the days where students who may have had a disability were tucked into a classroom, at the end of the hallway and never saw their peers. Now, a lot of our kids who have IEPs are educated in the general classroom. When I was a teacher at my school, we called them cooperative or co-op classrooms. So they're, had a special ed teacher and a general regular education teacher in the room together, because the whole idea is that we're placing those students in their least restrictive environment where they can be with their peers the most. And then procedural safeguards. So this comes back to those parents' rights that the children have in their education. These are rights that we're going to focus on because they are even there when the child has been removed. So we're going to start off kind of focusing on who gets an IEP. So these are KRA categories. So these are actually specific to Kentucky. IDEA, being federal, has some broader categories, and the law states that states can get more broad, i.e. they can offer kind of larger categories that more kids could fit into, but they can't go narrower. They can't pull back services from the federal level. So there is one of these categories that Kentucky has kind of broadened further than what the federal mandate is, which actually I think benefits a lot of our kids specifically. So autism is one of the categories, deaf blindness, developmental delays. This is only for students who are between ages 3 and 8 years of age. The eligibility for DD ends on the child's 9th birthday. And developmental delays is not necessarily a low functioning child. It's usually actually looks more like a low average child, one of those kind of kids that maybe is slightly borderline on the academic scale. And they need accommodations to catch up and some specifically designed instruction. And I bring this up because these a lot of times in my teaching career, but then also in my mother-in-law's career as a school psychologist, these are the kids who may have been really environmentally deprived when they were younger. So we think about our CASA kids, right, who may have been in neglectful environments or in deprived environments. So these are kids who may come in really low in speech or really low in kind of just those general life skills, but can catch up once they're in a school environment where it's a very rich environment. And so by the age of 9, they may not really have that developmental delay anymore. And so they won't qualify for anything else once they reach their 9th birthday. They won't qualify in any of these other categories, which is actually a good thing because it means that we've caught these kids up. The next one is emotional behavior disability. This is the one that is broader in the state of Kentucky than the federal IDEA, which is great because this means that several, more kids who may have behavioral disabilities will qualify than what they would have at just the federal level. Hearing impairments, mental disability, so mild mental disability, MMD is what it can sometimes be called, and functional mental disability, FMD. These are our kids that are, especially our FMD kids, are those ones that are really high need kids. Orthopedic impairment, other health impairments, specific learning disabilities, speech language impairment, traumatic brain injuries, visual impairment, and then if they have I do want to note here, since some of these are medical diagnoses as well, right? So if you're diagnosed as deaf and you have a hearing impairment, that's a medical diagnosis, but a medical diagnosis doesn't automatically qualify a child for an IEP. It's not like you went to the doctor and you're diagnosed with this thing and then you walk into the school with the diagnosis and you go, okay, I get an IEP now. Children have to fall into one of these categories, but even beyond that, they have to be evaluated because the disability has to have an adverse effect that impedes the progress of the educational performance. So basically meaning it has to affect the child's academics. It has to affect the way the child's learning in school and their access to the curriculum. So just because the child has a medical diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean that that medical diagnosis is going to affect them in their educational performance. And everything is kind of compared to non-disabled peers of a similar age. Any questions so far before we kind of move into this next section? Just feel free to shout out. No? Okay, so now we're moving on to the steps of an IEP. So this is really from start to finish, how a kiddo might get an IEP. So the reason I felt like this is important for you guys to know as CASAs is because if you call the school and say, hey, little Johnny, I've been looking at his grades and I've seen some notes from pulling academic records, and it seems like he's kind of always consistently behind, and just wondered if anyone had ever thought about an IEP. And the teacher says back to you, oh yeah, we're actually, looking at the eligibility. Well, then you know exactly where you're falling in this process. Or, oh yeah, a referral has been put in. Then you know exactly where we are. We're kind of start towards the beginning of this process. Or if they say, oh, he was just reevaluated, well, then hopefully now you're going to know exactly how frequently that occurs. So this is kind of the start to finish. So the first thing that is going to happen is a referral has to be made. A referral, it comes into the school saying that we think the child might have a disability and needs special education services. Anyone who has knowledge that the child and suspects that the child may have a disability can make a referral. This includes teachers and parents. So if you're a parent of a child and you think, oh, my child might have a disability, I'm going to call the school and make a referral. That's appropriate. Now, as CASAs, this kind of becomes one of those situations where if you kind of know our role, we don't necessarily refer to services right off the bat. So we, meaning us as CASA, we are information gatherers. And so if you think about it, if you call, let me back up a second. We're information gatherers. We, as some of the staff always like to say, we are a sponge, not a faucet. We take information in to put in our court reports and provide to the judge. We don't give information out, right? We don't call, just anyone willy-nilly and give information about the children that we're working with. So if you're calling the school to make a referral, you might be needing to end up giving out information that it's not appropriate for us to give out, right? So we probably aren't going to ever be the ones to call the school and make a referral due to confidentiality. But there are some ways beyond the court report that you can advocate for a child to get a referral. So obviously the court report is the big one. You can make a recommendation that the child be referred for an IEP. But you could talk to the social worker. You could see, if the social worker has any information, or talk to the social worker about your concerns and say, have you talked to the parent or anything like that, kind of share information. You can talk to the school counselor, the teacher, the school psychologist, and ask if a referral has ever been made. So that's definitely an appropriate thing, gathering information about if a referral has been made, if the child was ever evaluated, what the results of that evaluation were, what assistance is the child getting right now in regards to their academics. So if the teacher says, oh, they're really low in reading, I would follow up with, okay, well, what kind of assistance are they getting? Are they getting intervention of any type? And we're going to talk about those different levels of intervention. Talk to the child about how they feel in school, right? Some kids are very articulate and are able to kind of say, yeah, I feel like everything is really tough for me. That's a really good piece of information to put in your court report if you're going to advocate for an IEP, because if the child feels like they're struggling, that's something that probably should be shared. And if it's a non-removal, you can talk to the parents on their thoughts about their child's educational performance or experiences. So if you have a case where the parent is like, yeah, I'm kind of, how do you feel like little Johnny's doing in school? Yeah, I am concerned. Okay, have you ever talked to the school? Have you ever called the teacher? Have you ever asked for an IEP? Those are just questions you're asking to try to gather information. You're not telling them they need to do anything. You're just asking so you can put it in your court report. So moving forward, anyone can ask the school to evaluate the child for special education at any time. So that's a good point too. It doesn't have to happen at the beginning of the school year. It doesn't have to happen right at the beginning of the semester. Any time of the year, someone can ask for the child to be evaluated. Depending on the suspected disability, the child may need to go through intervention first. So this is something that is across the state of Kentucky. If it's an academic concern or a behavioral concern, they might need to try different interventions before we move straight to an IEP. Now, if a child is deaf or blind, they might not need to be interventions because we can't change the child being deaf or the child being blind with interventions. We're not going to move them up the academic ladder because, we probably can't change their hearing or vision impairment. So it depends on the disability. School staff will invite the parent to a meeting to discuss the referral. So if the referral comes in from a teacher or the parent or the librarian, and whoever puts the referral in, at that point, the school staff is going to have the parent come in, and they have to have the parent sign consent to evaluate. Now, I want to make note of this, that
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you keep referring to the parent and the parent's involvement. The one case that I've had involving any sort of IEP and 401s, all that stuff, the children were in foster care. So I'm assuming that you're substituting foster parent for parent in these situations, correct?
Actually, I am not. You beat me to the punch, but you bring up a really good point. So I'll just go ahead and bring it up. So no, foster parents are not able to sign as the parent because they're not. So really, when I say parent, until a TPR has occurred, it is still the parent. It is.
And what if you can't get the parent to be involved at all? What happens then?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different scenarios that could play out. So one could be that we haven't gotten to a TPR, and so even though it's a removal, the parent still has, they're still the person who needs to sign the paperwork. Now, and my mother-in-law could probably kind of speak to this as well, but if we know who the parent is and we know where they are and we know how to get in touch with them, the school is really, really, really going to work with the parent to get that paperwork signed. And I can probably, my mother-in-law may be able to correct me, but I remember we had our school psychologist go to the home of the parent to explain and get them to sign the consent for evaluation sometime.
Yeah, right.
So there are situations where the school is really, really going to try to work with that parent, especially at this stage where it's just the referral. A lot of times what is kind of said to the parent is, look, you're not signing for your child to get extra services or anything like that. We're not signing for services yet. You're just signing paperwork for your child to consent to be evaluated. And I
have a question.
Hold on, let me finish this answer.
Sure, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. We're just signing for evaluation. And at some point, that is just more information for your child, right? And for you as the parent. And so there's no harm in having more information. Now, the second part of this is if for some reason the child's in foster care and the parent is completely MIA, they've moved to a different state, no one can get a hold of them, the social worker has no idea where they are, they've basically up and left. That is where there's a role called surrogate parents. And a surrogate parent is someone who is trained. So my mother-in-law has also served in this role as well. And basically they are appointed almost kind of like in the same vein of CASA kind of, they're appointed to be there for the child's best interests and to speak on the child's behalf in the IEP, and they will sign the consent. So at no point is the foster parent ever signing paperwork, or for that matter, the cabinet signing paperwork. The social workers also do not sign IEP paperwork. So in the worst case scenario, there are situations where on rare occasions, judges have signed paperwork.
So Liz, this situation with a surrogate, is that through what sort of school administration body procedure does that work through?
Yeah, Cindy, do you have an answer to that?
The school system will have certain people that have agreed to serve as surrogates, and they go through a training with them. And so those people will be called whenever there is the need for that. If there's a parent that is MIA, or whenever they need a surrogate, the school system then just calls one of those surrogates, and usually you're assigned to a student, throughout that whole school year, or as long as that student is there in that school system as their surrogate.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question about an IEP and multiple school systems that child is in. do they transfer across county lines? I assume they transfer within a county, but do they transfer across county lines?
Yeah, so we're that you're also jumping ahead, but that's okay. Yes, if they are moving within the state of Kentucky,
Okay.
the IEP transfers, and the IEP transfers, and I can jump down to that slide real fast. Give me just a second so I don't misquote myself. So a child moves to this within the same state in the same academic year. The new school must provide the services that are comparable to the ones that are in the child's IEP. So let's say a child moved from Jessamine County to Fayette County. The IEP should transfer, but obviously we know sometimes things don't happen exactly like that. So what they'll do is they'll provide the services that are listed as close as they can to what was created in the Jessamine County IEP. And then they'll either do one of two things. Most frequently, they will adopt the child's IEP from the previous public agency, aka school. Or they will develop, adopt, and implement a new IEP that has applicable requirements. So the child's IEP does transfer with them. Does it happen instantaneously?
In the state,
yeah.
In the state of Kentucky, it's all on the Infinite campus. And so it's really easy if they move from one school to the next, even if it takes a while to get the actual paperwork, we can, the signed signatures and so forth, we can pull it up online and see that what the IEP was. And so go ahead and try to implement it within, the receiving county pretty quickly,
So yeah, is it gonna happen? I've had kids who literally have walked in halfway through the day and it's their first day at school. And obviously their accommodations might not start that exact first day that they walk in my classroom because I don't even have a desk for them. But in general, people usually get that paperwork pretty quick because like Cindy said, it's all within the same online system within the state of Kentucky. Good questions though, guys. Already thinking ahead from where I was going. Any other questions at this point? Awesome, perfect. So kind of just to finish up that referral process. So, and I did not mention this, but it's in another slide, but I'll just go ahead and mention it. The last part is, on the very off chance that that parent is available, we know where they are, there's not a reason to have a surrogate parent, but they're just not willing to sign the paperwork. There are rare situations where they go to mediation, right? So the school will kind of go through a due process and go through mediation. So there are those steps in those, really significant situations. But I mean, Cindy, you worked as a school psychologist for a really long time. How often did that really happen?
I mean, honestly, I don't think that I was ever involved in one. I was involved in one in North Carolina when I was there years ago, where the parent was refusing services. And we felt that strongly about the child that we did take it to mediation. But that's the only case in my 32 years. But the thing is, obviously, parent rights are strongly considered. And so you have to be very careful about saying that you're going to definitely step over that and say, we know what's best,
There's that fine balance too of like basically kind of what you're saying is parents' rights, and you really have to feel that they are acting significantly against the best interest of their child in order to go to that due process.
Just like every other aspect of, rights in their culture.
Yeah. And so kind of, if you guys think back to your CASA training in the same vein, right? We don't remove CASA doesn't remove children at all, but the Cabinet for Health and Family Services doesn't remove children from homes where minimum sufficient level of care is being met and children are safe, right? We don't just remove children willy-nilly. That is, that goes against the rights of the parent to parent their child. So really we only do it when it's in the best interest of the child to have a child removed. Same situation, same kind of concept is like really it has to be within, strongly in the best interest of the child, and the parent is not acting in that way. So one of the things I wanted to note that's kind of an important piece is that the school has 60 days from when the parent signs consent to have the child evaluated and have that IEP meeting if an IEP is going to be developed. So this is why, if you've ever had a case come up where a child has a referral come in at the very end of April, like right around now, why they might not have an IEP at the start of the next school year, because this is 60 school days. So if school ends in a month, that's only 30 school days, right? Then we go the entire summer, then we get back to school and they still have 30 more days to do the evaluation. So just note that if you ever have IEP conversations come up towards the end of the school year, you may see what you feel like is a pretty significant delay in the child getting their IEP or getting evaluated, but that is partially because there's a summer in the middle, and it's 60 school days. The other thing I wanted to make note of is that just because a referral is made does not mean that an evaluation will always occur, right? A meeting will be held, right? And to see if the evaluation is necessary, but sometimes it could be things like the child might need to go through some interventions first, and let's see if the interventions work before we go through the evaluation process, right? And interventions are something that are kind of, if you think about how intense services get, we don't have to go through these steps, but in terms of intensity, we kind of have intervention. They're called RTI, response to intervention. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Then we have 504s, which again, we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then finally, IEPs. So if the child has not even gone through some sort of kind of intervention, some kind of push in, pull out, intense academic kind of help, then we might not drop all the way down to an IEP right away. So just know that if a referral is being made, we might not always go through the rest of this process. But if we move forward, the parent signs.
Liz?
Yes. Yes.
This is, I was going to add on that in case somebody was wondering, another part of that 60-day thing is sometimes if you get a child and you request some evaluations, or because, any parent can request at any time. Another thing about their 60-day allotment there is sometimes they want to see that child in a classroom setting for certain particular things, like how are they interacting and accepting instruction? How are they interacting with their peers? Can they take social cues? And so that 60 days allows, for example, if you bring this up in April, summer's getting ready to come in, it's the end of the year. So they're going to want to see that child in their environment, in their new classroom when that starts in April. And what that does is help them formulate opinions from what they're seeing with those types of interactions for particular disabilities associated with an IEP. So that's a bonus to the 60 days as well.
Yeah.
But a parent can always talk to a teacher, and like Liz mentioned with RTIs, those RTIs interventions may look like something like a pull-out reading group or a math table focus group that they do for 20 minutes a day. And those are types of intervention that they will use to further investigate whether they want to implement an IEP for that child.
Yep, exactly. And Christy, you hit the nail on the head of kind of where I was going, which is that one of the things about evaluations is that we need lots of different data points, right? And so they take time to gather. And some of those, just like you said, are witnessing the child in the classroom. And so you make a really excellent point that if a child is in, say, 3rd grade, and then they're going to move to 4th grade, and we have that referral come in April, the 4th grade classroom might be a little different than the 3rd grade classroom. And so we want to see them in that new 4th grade classroom, because that's when the IEP is going to be like starting. So make a really good point. So evaluations, Christy kind of started to lead into this. The evaluation is not just one data point. It's going to be multiple data points. It's going to be classroom data. It's going to be results from evidence-based interventions. It's going to be formal and informal assessments. And test scores can even be used. If a test score is used, they have to explain or the interpretation of the score that should be provided. So lots of different data points. The whole idea of evaluations is that you can't write an IEP to help a child go somewhere if you don't know where the child is. So that's the whole point of having to have having all of these different pieces of information put together. Input can come from teachers, parents, school psychologists, doctors, other professionals. Students' performance data reflects student performance in both academic and non-academic areas. So we're not always talking about like how they're doing in reading necessarily. there are different components. Students' performance data assists the ARC team, which that's the team who is writing the IEP, on how to write the IEP, develop it, and then also think about implementation. So, like I said, the big focus is on present level of educational performance, AKA where the child is. So when I said that they can be focused on both academic and non-academic areas of performance, you might be thinking, okay, academic, I get that. That's going to be the reading, the math, the writing, but it also is going to be things like progress on, just general goals. So Common Core, you might have heard of that before if you have kiddos. That's that curriculum of what kids should know at each grade. So where are they falling, and kind of knowing that information. And then performance on state, district, and even classroom assessments. So just general tests in the classroom. But the non-academic stuff can be essential skills, like literally, basics, brushing your teeth, not that you brush your teeth at school, but all those kind of basic skills, employable skills, daily living activities, behaviors. Behaviors a big one when you think about some of our kiddos and the behaviors that they have from the trauma they've incurred. Mobility, social and emotional status, and mental health, which is also another large component with our CASA kiddos. So the evaluations provide a full picture for the child's strengths and their needs. And the law requires that schools follow certain guidelines when completing the evaluations. And they seem like basics, but they are really important things to consider. So any testing and evaluations have to be provided in the child's native language. So if they speak a different language at home, the testing has to be done in their native language as best as possible. Sometimes, if you've dealt with a case with a really, 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 really rare dialect, that's going to be a challenge. The variety of tests and strategies have to kind of gather different information. No one test can be used. All evaluations, all tests have to be administered by trained individuals. So you can't just have someone walking off the street and try to do an IQ test. I don't know how to do an IQ test. I was a teacher. That's not my job. That was my mother-in-law's job. So she knows how to do IQ tests. I do not. The tests have to take into consideration things like your child's sensory, so vision and hearing, motor and communication and speech problems. And what I mean by that, the good example is if a child has vision loss and they shouldn't be labeled with mild mental disability because they were given a test where they scored low, because they have to be able to see that test. That's not helpful. That doesn't give us any new information. So just be aware that is a component. We have to think about what the child is, able to do to some degree. And then finally, not every evaluation is going to be the same, right? Because kids don't need to be evaluated in areas where we don't think that they have a disability. So we're evaluating them in areas where they have a suspected disability. All children are not the same, so they're not going to receive the same evaluations. Okay, examples of different types of evaluations. The ones that have an asterisk mean that they usually happen regardless of the situation. Behavior observations in the classroom. Christy already touched on this. Achievement testing, reading, math, writing. Social development history. Those are going to be the three big ones that all kiddos are going to have. And then if they have emotional behavior disorder, disabilities, teachers, parents, they may do a behavior rating scale. So as a teacher, I would a lot of times get a rating scale, and I would rate the student on kind of how their behavior was at different points in the day and in different transitions. Students who might be MMD or FMD, they're going to have an adaptive behavior scale. So that's adaptive is things like brushing your teeth. IQ testing. We don't do IQ testing for every kid. In fact, we really either use it to rule out and or determine if IQ is a factor. So if there's kind of that we're not quite sure if it's a language barrier, we're not quite sure what's going on, we're going to possibly use an IQ test there. Now, I do want to make a note about language barriers, because we do have CASA kiddos who come to us who don't speak English, or English is not their first language. So evaluations have to be given in the native language, but that can be really difficult sometimes. Like I said, if we have a really unique language and we don't have anyone in the area who can kind of conduct an evaluation in that language. Students who do not speak disabilities students who do not speak English can also have disabilities, but it can sometimes be harder to figure out if it's a language issue or if it's a disability issue, even when the test is given in the child's native language. And the example that I'll give is, so we have a young child, right? And they're really behind in reading, okay? And they speak Spanish at home. So we might think about giving them some of the evaluations in Spanish, but they've also never learned to read in Spanish. They might speak Spanish, but they don't learn how to read in Spanish. They don't learn how to read in English. They're almost what we would call kids, they're illiterate. So giving them a test to see how they read in Spanish is not going to be any more helpful than giving them a test in English, depending on the child. So make note of that. The other thing is we can translate assessments and evaluations, but sometimes they don't always perfectly translate. And that can be literally verbiage, right? There are certain languages where it just doesn't, like the example doesn't translate correctly, but also we all talk about a lot of cultural bias. So there might be situations where the example being given in the evaluation wouldn't happen in that culture, or wouldn't make sense in that culture. So the question is going to be skewed and the answer is going to be skewed. So those are all kind of things to think about if you have a child who's being evaluated who has a language barrier, or is possibly a refugee, kind of has a different cultural background that's, could possibly kind of come up with the cultural bias that's in these evaluations and assessments. The other thing is, if a child does have a language barrier, English is not their first language, usually we're looking at 2 to 3 years of English language learning services, ELL services, before an evaluation, depending on the suspected disability. And that's because we need to see that language is not a barrier. Now, again, depending on the disability, like adaptive behaviors, so brushing your teeth, there's not going to be a language barrier there. So if we have some concerns about certain disabilities and they're testing really low on an adaptive behavior scale, that's going to kind of give us some insight. So it really is tricky with kids who may be refugees or come from different language backgrounds.
Hey Liz, can I just
Yes.
throw in that your ELL teacher can help a lot with that. There's a difference what they call basic conversational skills. So a child may seem like they have acquired English relatively well because they can carry on a conversation, but they distinguish between that and what they call CALC, which is academic language. And the ELL teachers actually have assessments that they do. So we usually like to see kids have a certain level of CALC before we would go to looking at an evaluation for, say, a learning disability. Now, if we're looking at a cognitive delay, like an intellectual disability, then we can use nonverbal tests and everything. But if we're looking at academic skills, just reading, writing, and math, then we really need to have that certain level of academic language before we would want to look at that.
Yeah. And I can just tell you guys from experience that I had several students in my classroom who were ELL students who I thought they may have a learning disability. And it was a lot of conversations with our amazing ELL teacher that I had in our building when I taught, because I was looking for general learning disabilities, right? Like the things that I had been taught just as a general education teacher as like kind of red flags. And it can be very different. And like she was like like Cindy was just saying, like I was thinking that they should have this academic language, and this was being pointed out that there's kind of two different things. So if you have a kiddo who is not a native English speaker and we're seeing some academic concerns, I would really recommend that you as the CASA also reach out to the ELL teacher along with the regular education teacher to see what the ELL teacher has to say, especially if they are receiving ELL services. That would be a big one. Awesome. So we've done the evaluation, we've had the referral, we've now done an evaluation. Now we have all these data points. So we're going to talk about the eligibility. So this is where we're talking, like looking at the evaluation results and saying, is this child eligible for an IEP or not? So the ARC, which is a team, will decide if the child's evaluation results meet the specific criteria for the child to get an IEP. And then they will use that evaluation results kind of as evidence to argue what the child needs. Almost kind of think about it when you're writing a court report. You write all that information and then you back up your recommendations in the court report. Same concept. So for the child that is determined to be eligible for an IEP, they have to meet the criteria adopted by the Kentucky Department of Education. And like I said, their disability has to affect their academic performance. And then they will call a second meeting. So once they've decided that the child is eligible, they call that second meeting. That is what we think of mostly as an ARC meeting. That's where the IEP is presented. We've decided that the kid is eligible. The ARC team starts to write that IEP, and then we come together for a second meeting. So there's that first meeting at the beginning when we have permission to sign the referral. Now we're at the second meeting. There's 2 big meetings. So as they're writing the IEP, we want to talk about what's included in an IEP. Couple of big points. We're going to break each one of these down. Present levels of performance, measurable annual goals, specifically designed instruction, who, when, and by whom are the services and supports being provided, or who will provide those, how, when, and by whom will progress be monitored and measured, related services and accommodations, and then transitional planning for kids who are 14 and older. Like I said earlier, we're talking kind of looking forward to ahead, where we want to go, college, trade school, looking beyond graduation. The ARC team who's writing that IEP will consider the strengths of the student. They'll consider the concerns of the parent for enhancing the education of their student, the results from the initial and most recent evaluation, so if there happen to be 2 different sets, and then the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the student. So breaking those down, we're going to this is the roadmap to make an IEP. We start off with, where are we? That's the present levels and special factors. Where do we want to go? The measurable goals, we gotta have a goal. And sometimes it'll also include transitional services, like looking ahead where we want to go. Then we talk about, how do we get there? That's the bulk of the IEP. That's where we're talking about what kind of special instruction is this kiddo getting? What kind of accommodations and modifications? Do they have extra related services? All of that stuff. And then at the very end, when and where is the learning happening? So is it happening in the general classroom? Is it happening in a more specific, special ed classroom? That's where we're breaking that down. So a statement of the child's present level of academic achievements and functional performance. So this is where we're talking about where the kid is right now. And we look at this in multiple different categories. We're not just looking at it in one area. So these could be communication skills. So how well does your child understand and express language, including articulation and fluency? Academic performance. So how does the child do in reading and comprehension, math, calculation, reasoning, oral and written expression, and then also listening and learning styles. Health, vision, hearing, motor abilities. This is any information relevant to the health and physical needs of the child. Social and emotional status. This includes functional performance, about your child's kind of social and interpersonal behavior and skills. So that classroom observation, a lot of that information might be coming from there. General intelligence. This is a summary of the child's thinking and reasoning skills. Transitional needs, like I said, this is for kiddos who are 8th grade or 14. This is going to be things like community experience, employment, post-school living objectives, acquisition of daily living skills. So again, if you think about some of those conversations you might be having with kids in care who are turning or looking at possibly aging out or going PPLA, similar conversation. Functional vision and learning media. This is for kids who have visual impairment. It's just a summary of kind of what impact there is from the visual impairment on their literacy skills. And then functional hearing, listening, and communication assessment is for kids who are hearing impaired. We're focusing on the impact of the student's hearing impairment on just their general educational performance. So lots of different categories that we have to look at about where this kiddo is in multiple areas. Then we consider some special factors too. Things like behavior issues, if they're a limited English proficiency, if they're blind or visually impaired, their communication needs, if they're deaf and hard of hearing, and then assistive technology, which I have the next slide just talks briefly about assistive technology. If you're not familiar with that language, assistive technology, it does not mean a computer. It can be a wide range of things. It can be everything from like a pencil grip or a picture board, if you've ever seen a binder with all the different pictures and a child can point and kind of use that as a way to communicate, all the way down to a text reader or a speech generating device. So we've got a wide range of assistive technology. It doesn't just mean a computer. The next part of the IEP is that measurable annual goals, which if you're familiar with any sort of SMART goal, same concept, where it's a very well-constructed goal. And it's going to include academic and functional goals. It's also going to have different kind of midpoints or benchmarks. Those goals are going to break down into smaller objectives. So the reason I'm telling you that is that as a CASA, you don't have to wait an entire year to ask, hey, can I get an update on where they are on their measurable goals? You should be checking in regularly, ever so often, every quarter or so, saying, hey, how are we doing? Can I get a progress report on their IEP? Where are we at kind of getting to those measurable goals, checking on those benchmarks. The measurable goals are going to be written very specifically, like I said. So they're going to have an audience, which is the child. They're going to define the behavior, what they want the child to do, the circumstances. So, when is this kind of goal going to kind of be evaluated? What the benchmark is, how it's going to be evaluated, and how frequently. So it's going to end up reading something like, when given 20 correlated vocabulary words, Mary will orally define 18 of the 20 words correctly for 4 consecutive probes as measured by a weekly checklist. It's going to be very specific so that when you're reading that IEP, you should be able to kind of see what your CASA child is working towards. So you have a good understanding of how to kind of interpret that and put it in your court report to the judge and that kind of thing if necessary. Looking at those goals, we also need to think about, like I said, how is the child going to get to those goals? We can't just lay it out and then hope the child gets there. So this is where we're talking about any sort of supplementary aids or services, which can be strategies, devices that help the child meet their goal. These are used for the child to be involved and make progress in the general curriculum and to provide the child with equal opportunity to participate in non-academic extracurricular activities. So examples of these are like communication systems, large print text, extended time to complete assignments, visual schedules, visual timers. If you've ever seen those timers that look like a pie chart and they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, that's what I mean by a visual timer. My husband uses one. They're actually quite great. Organizational systems, movement breaks, assistive technologies, like I was just saying, a lot of range of assistive technology. And then we're also going to have a statement determining the accommodations that the child needs. And these are accommodations that would be on state and district-wide testing, and that's why they need to be laid out in the IEP so the child can use them in state and district-wide testing. But one of the things I really want to point out here is that a child does not just use accommodations on state and district-wide testing. That's actually illegal. If it's laid out in the child's IEP, they need to be receiving those accommodations all the time. So one of the things that you can kind of be looking for is, okay, what accommodations should my child be getting? That my CASA kiddo should be getting extended time. They should be getting movement breaks. Okay, so then when you call the school to talk to the teacher, you could say, hey, how are their accommodations helping them? How is the IEP working? I'd love to kind of, know, so I can report to the judge that they're doing well in school and their movement breaks are doing really well. So know that accommodations are not just for testing, even though it says that they're to kind of be thought about with testing, they actually need to happen throughout the entirety. Now, this is the thing that comes up a lot, the difference between accommodations and modifications. Kiddos with IEPs can have modifications and accommodations, but they are different. So I want you to be aware that if a teacher says, oh, they're getting this modification, you kind of understand the difference. A modification directly alters the material or the curriculum that the child is interacting with. So for example, if they're taking a test and every other child in the classroom, there's 10 questions on this test. But for this child, those 2 last questions are going to be really hard. Those are those triple digit addition problems. They can't do triple digit addition. They're taking those 2 questions off the test for this child. And now their test is 8 out of 8. And so they still get all 8 right. They get 100%. That's a modification. Things like providing open notes for the test where they have the access to the material, that's a modification. They're literally modifying what is expected of the child in terms of the academic knowledge, for example. An accommodation is affecting the way that the child has access to the curriculum, but is not changing the curriculum itself. So for example, back to that test, you got 10 questions. All 10 questions are still going to be on the test for that kiddo. They're going to have to do that triple digit addition problem, but they have extended time. They have longer amounts of time to take the test. Everyone else has to take it in 30 minutes. They have 45 minutes. Same thing with having, being able to underline or highlight things that they normally wouldn't be able to underline or highlight. Another example is, this comes up a lot when we did state testing, is a kiddo who might not be able to read the material, right? But we're practicing comparing and contrasting koala bears and panda bears, right? And the skill that they need to demonstrate is that they can share the compare and contrast koala bears and panda bears. They know the similarities and differences from reading this article. We are going to read the article to them, same article that all the other kids just read themselves. We're not changing the article, making it easier. And then at the end, they're going to be asked, what are the similarities to koala bears and pandas? What are the differences? So they're still expected to give us the same results. They just didn't have to read the article themselves. Also, even things like preferential seating, so sitting closer to the teacher so it's easier to focus, that's an accommodation. Same material as the rest of the class, but they're just closer to the teacher. Any other questions right now? And we are about 3/4 the way through. I know that we are just about at time, so if you need to hop off, that's totally okay, but we're going to keep plugging away just because we had some good questions earlier. So the last couple of things included in IEP is a statement of special education and related services that need to be provided to the child. So what is a related service and how is it different than an accommodation? A related service is the developmental, corrective, or otherwise supportive service that may be required to assist the child with the disability to benefit from special education. So these are situations like a communication device, but also things like transportation. So if they need separate types of transportation, things like OT, speech, PT. So, right, the child might get movement breaks. That might be kind of an accommodation of some sort, but then they're also going to go to OT. That's a related service. So they might also have assisting in developing positive behavior strategies. That might be meeting with the school counselor, or meeting with, at my school, we had what's called the PASS program with the behavior specialist. So someone who's going to kind of provide that related service. A statement of specifically designed instruction. So this is literally exactly what it sounds like. It is a way that a teacher is instructing, assessing, and then reteaching the student. And it's adapting and modifying possibly the content for the child. And so the reason that we have specifically designed instruction is because basically the child is not able to access the instruction the way it's normally being taught. So it's necessary for this child specifically to make progress towards their annual goal versus the other children in the classroom can make progress without this specifically designed instruction. And it's usually implemented by a special education teacher. And like I said, it's not regularly available to the rest of the classroom because they don't need that extra access point. And then a statement on the student's participation in alternate assessment. This very rarely happens, but on the off chance that a child is not able to participate in normal assessment, such as things like state testing, then they can have a statement of alternate assessment. Alternate assessment is like looked at annually, so it can change as well. So we've talked about how we're going to get this, where this kid needs to go and how we're going to get there. And now where is this going to happen? So this is coming up with the least restrictive placement and kind of where the child is going to be placed. And least restrictive to most restrictive, it's a continuum, right? So it's not like there's just two options, regular classroom and special ed classroom. There's actually a lot of options. We might also have things like a special school for the child to go to. We might have things like homebound instruction, or even let's think about the fact that the child, sometimes we have kiddos who are in the hospital, right? I think even about our CASA cases where we have children who are in institutions, right? So they're in long-term residential facilities. That's going to be different than going to the general classroom. They might be educated at that long-term residential facility. So that's that kind of continuum. But what we're really looking at is determining where the IEP services can occur so that the child can get the education that they need and all the accommodations and all the extra services that they need can be provided in the least restrictive placement. So I also want to make note that that might mean that they spend 6 out of 8 hours of the day in the general regular classroom, and then they only do 2 hours of the day in a special education classroom because those are the 2 hours where the content is more common, like there needs to be more accommodations and more modifications, and that can't happen in the general classroom. So it really just depends on the child. And then this is something to kind of be aware of. Again, it's kind of rare, and it is for kids who have really high needs or are low functioning, but they do have extended school year services written into IEPs if necessary. And this is exactly what it sounds like, which is basically services that are provided through the summer, basically an extended school year. Now, this is very specific. It's for kids who are going to regress. Now, you might be thinking, Liz, all kids regress. Yes, at the beginning of every school year, I had to reteach some stuff from the past year. All kids regress in the summers. This is specifically for kids who are going to regress so much more than their peers. And it's going to take a lot more time for those students to recoup the loss of those skills. That's why we would have extended school year services. Okay, so that's kind of all the pieces of an IEP. Any questions at this point? Alrighty, so the last kind of little pieces are actually that physical meeting, right? So we now have the IEP meeting. In the state of Kentucky, they're also called ARC or ARC meetings. It was funny when I was student teaching, the teachers in Fayette County, some of them called them ARC meetings. When I went to Jessamine County, they were mostly ARC meetings. So it kind of just depends on the area, but ARC, ARC, or IEP meeting. So the kid's been evaluated. They're made, they're deemed eligible. We're having the second meeting with the team coming with a drafted IEP. ARC stands for Admissions and Release Committee. And the ARC team is a school-based team that is made up of people who help to decide whether or not the child is eligible for special education and then how those services are going to be provided. So the whole idea of it being a team is this is not falling on one person. It's not one person's job to make sure that this child is getting what they need. It's not one person's decision on whether or not they get the IEP. It's a team, right? The team is responsible for creating the IEP, ensuring that it's implemented, reviewing the progress towards the goals, and then revising it as needed. So once evaluation has occurred and the child has been deemed eligible, there will be a draft of the IEP made before this meeting's called. So we're not making this IEP paperwork, like we're not filling it out in this meeting. They're coming with something ready. And then at this meeting, again, there's a second part where the parents will then need to, again, sign consent for the child to start receiving services. So signing at the beginning with a referral, signing later when they are saying that they're consenting to receiving services. Again, it's the same situation where if the parent is MIA, we don't know where they are, there's going to be a surrogate parent. And if they are having some trouble, the school's going to really work with them to understand what the services are and how their child needs them. And at the very end of the day, if needed, in very rare situations, they can go through a due process hearing. ARC or IEP meetings, they occur annually, but they can also be called at any time. So they have to occur annually, but at any point someone can say, hey, the kid isn't making any progress, or, oh my gosh, the kid has already met their goals and it's only been 6 months. We need to meet again to, reevaluate or rework this IEP. So anyone can call for the meeting to happen again. One thing to know is that once the meeting has happened annually in person, and in person, COVID kind of threw things for a loop, but we're back to normal now, mostly in our school system at least. So it is in person, but once that annual meeting has occurred, if someone feels like there needs to be reworking on the IEP, like for example, the child's already met their goals, they can do that just through written correspondence if everyone agrees to it. So just know that if someone's like, oh yeah, their IEP is being reworked, there might be a meeting, but there also might not be a meeting, just kind of depends. So you might be wondering, a couple of things to note. Parents can and should get a copy of the IEP, but you as the CASA should also request a copy of the IEP. You also are able to be in the ARC meeting with your court order, and you can request detailed periodic reports on kind of where data is and how the child is reaching their annual goals. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to check in more than just once a year. So you are going to go to this ARC meeting and you're like, who's going to be in the room? I'm glad you asked. So first off, the student can be in the room, especially if they're over the age of 18 or not 18. They're over the age of 14 or they're in 8th grade. They can be in the room and should be in the room, but younger kids can be in the room as well. There is the idea that, younger children are able to come and maybe even start to develop some of those self-advocacy skills, especially if they feel really strongly about something going on with their academics, they are able to attend. Okay, then we have the teachers. And just wanted to make note that if the child does not attend the IEP meeting and they are over the age of 14 or they are in 8th grade, then the school must take other steps to ensure that the child's preferences and interests are considered. So just note that if for some reason your child is older, like 14, 15, 16, and they're not at the IEP, that you might want to make sure that the child's just ask like, hey, someone talk to the child about their preferences. So then we have teachers. So the regular education teacher is going to be there. I attended a couple of IEP meetings in my day. The special education teacher may or may not be there. It depends on if the child's disability means that they're going to be receiving services from that special education teacher. A good example is if a child is getting an IEP for speech, the special education teacher might not need to be there, but the speech pathologist will. So basically anyone who is going to be providing the services needs to be at the IEP meeting. So if the OT is going to be providing services, they got to be there. Speech pathologist, they got to be there. So just make note that you might walk in and be like, where's the special education teacher? Well, if they're just getting an IEP for just speech, they might not be there. An administrator who can provide and supervise the specifically designed instruction to meet the needs of the child. They're knowledgeable about the available resources and have knowledge of the general curriculum. A lot of times, so this is the role that I was speaking about earlier that Cindy used to have. They're called IRCs in Jessamine County. In general, they have different names in different counties. So you can usually kind of refer to them probably as the ARC chairperson, and most people will know what you're talking about. Other people that can be in the room can be the school principal, the assistant principal, the guidance counselor, the director of special education, whoever it is. Other administrators can be in the room, but there is always that ARC chair. Then the parent or the guardian. So like I said, the parent has to sign for the IEP to go into place and the child receives services. The parent also has input into the IEP development. So as we're walking through what the IEP includes with the parent, they can share their thoughts and kind of have a say in the revisions. There also is kind of an effort made to accommodate the parent to allow them to attend the meeting. And the parent is able to bring whoever they would like to the meeting. So just know that Great Aunt Sandy might be there if the parent wants Great Aunt Sandy to be there. Other people that can attend but may not be required are representatives from other agencies, such as just like a career or technical school, if that's being considered in kind of transitional services. Like I said, speech, physical therapy, OT, even if the child maybe isn't receiving those services, they can possibly be in the room. Social worker, therapist, lots of different people can attend, but they're not required. Note, someone always has to be there that can explain the evaluation results. So that usually could be the ARC chairperson, but for example, if the school psychologist did most of the evaluations, they might be there to speak to the evaluation results. And then required members of the ARC can be excused from attendance at the meeting if they're notified in advance in writing and the parent agrees. So if for some reason you walk in and the teacher's not there, doesn't mean that you have to, you're not going to stop the IEP meeting and be like, wait a second, the teacher's not here. First of all, that's not CASA's role, but second of all, just know that teachers have crazy schedules and maybe someone's sick. The IEP meeting can proceed. They just have to know that, have it in writing, that they're not going to be there, and that team member that's not there has to be able to provide written kind of understanding of how they're going to, what they would have been bringing up in the meeting. Okay, last part of the IEP process is that yearly meeting. So every year the child has an IEP meeting, and that is when they're looking at the progress that's being made and determine whether or not the measurable annual goals need to be updated. They're going to look at progress in the general curriculum. They're going to look if the child needs to be reevaluated for some reason. They're going to look about information that is provided both by the student and the parent, and the student's strengths, and anything else that may have come up. Meetings can also be held after foster care placement changes. So just being aware that they don't have to, there's no law stating that, but some schools try to, do a meeting when placements have changed. Then every 3 years, the child has to be reevaluated. Now it can be that if everyone agrees, past evaluations can be adopted just to use for like moving forward, but usually a child is reevaluated every 3 years. And one of the things that I forgot to mention earlier is that if the parent gets the evaluation results and they do not agree with the evaluation results, the parent is able to request just one reevaluation done by a third party. Now, they can't pick anybody out of the entire United States or the world. There's a third-party list that the school provides, but they are able to request one reevaluation. That's called an ELL. So on the off chance that you ever hear that language get brought up, it means that the parent is asking for the child to be reevaluated because they don't agree with the evaluation results that the school's providing.
Liz, just real quick, I don't know if you said ELL, it's called an IEE. You just misquoted your acronyms there. Oh. You said ELL. Just to clarify, it's called an
ELL is English language learner. Thank you, Cindy, for catching my mistake.
Sure.
Okay, so last couple of little things that I felt like were really important for you as CASA to know. Behavior. A lot of times, our kiddos maybe have some adverse behaviors, right? If behavior is a concern, it must be addressed in the IEP. And there is kind of a couple of different components. A functional behavior assessment, an FBA, is an assessment that's done to gather information regarding the child's behavior so that they can develop positive behavioral supports. The FBA is used to create a BIP, not batter intervention. That might be something you've heard from court. This BIP is behavior intervention plan. It's a plan that is made for the child to develop strong social skills and positive behaviors that they need to be successful. A BIP does not have to just be tied to an IEP. So a child can have a behavior intervention plan without ever having an IEP. The school can do an informal kind of FBA, do some sort of assessment on where the child is behavior-wise, and create a behavior intervention plan. And a lot of times, if a child is receiving an IEP because of their behavior alone, the BIP should have already been in place, because that's that first level of intervention. So just know that if you have a CASA kiddo who is really struggling with their behavior in school, it's worth it to ask as the CASA, does this child have a behavior intervention plan? Is there some sort of plan created for helping this child's behavior? The big thing that comes up with behavior within an IEP is thinking about the fact that if the accommodations that the teacher is providing are so intense that it's not sustainable, even if they are working, right? Even if the accommodations are working, if the accommodations are so intense that it's unsustainable for the teacher to consistently provide those just as the regular classroom teacher, that's where it's kind of appropriate to start thinking about an IEP when it comes to behavior. And then there's just a couple of things I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of this, but just know that there are rules around suspension and expulsion when it comes to kids who have an IEP that is related to their behavior. So you can reach out to me. I'm at CASA, obviously, and I can point you kind of in the right direction. But in general, there are kind of some numbers of days that kids can be expelled and suspended and that kind of thing when there's behavior tied to their IEP. Now, there are also caveats to that, which is like if a child were to bring, a weapon to school, like some very significant things, then there's caveats to that as well, because there's always caveats. But in general, just know that there are some rules around that. Yes, Cindy. Sorry. Were you going to say something? No? Okay. Okay, so a couple other quick things. What is a 504? So you may have heard of a 504, and you may have thought that an IEP and a 504 is the same dang thing. It is not. A 504 is made for children who do not qualify for an IEP under IDEA, which if you think back to the very beginning of this conversation, IEPs fall under IDEA, right? But they do have some sort of disability under ADA. So 504 is larger than IDEA. IDEA has the IEPs. So a 504 plan addresses the unique learning needs of students with disabilities, just kind of like an IEP does. It provides reasonable accommodations, just like an IEP does. It just is also a little different. So how are they different? Well, an IEP is accommodations and modifications. A 504 is accommodations only that a regular teacher can do in the general classroom. So usually a special education teacher is not involved with a 504. That's just accommodations that a regular teacher can provide. So again, think about it as levels of intensity, right? You don't have to have a 504 and then move to an IEP, but a 504 is less intense than an IEP. The other thing is that students don't necessarily have to have done intervention to get to a 504. So a really good example that we see a lot with 504s is a kiddo who's been diagnosed with ADHD, right? So a child has been diagnosed by a school psychologist. They've been diagnosed by, not a school psychologist, they've been diagnosed by a psychiatrist or a general practitioner with ADHD. Right, their doctor says, oh, yep, this kid has ADHD. Okay, well, then we're going to kind of look at how is it affecting their academics, because it still needs to affect their academics in order for them to get a 504. And the example I always use is I had a student and she had ADHD. She took medication. I had no idea she had ADHD, right? None of the symptoms that a student would have maybe with ADHD. And what I mean by that is it wasn't affecting her academics, right? So it wasn't until March of that school year. It had her all of the fall and part of the spring before her mother was like, oh yeah, she has ADHD. That would be a kiddo who doesn't necessarily need a 504 because her diagnosis is not affecting her academics. But if a child maybe does need some accommodations because the ADHD diagnosis is affecting their academics, maybe accommodations like movement break or fidgets, then a 504 would be really appropriate, right? They don't need to go through RTI, that response to intervention. to get a 504, and it's just little accommodations that the teacher can give to help the student learn better. Like I said, movement breaks, a wiggle seat, those kinds of things. Now, some similarities between a 504 and an IEP. A parent still has to consent to a 504, and there still is an evaluation process, right? The kiddo cannot just come to school with the ADHD diagnosis from the doctor and that be enough to get a 504. We have to have the evaluation to see that it affects their academic performance. Progress is also monitored. Just like an IEP, we want to see if the 504 accommodations are working, so we're monitoring the progress. 2 more acronyms, I'm just loading them on. You might have already heard me say this, RTI, response to intervention. The goals of RTI are to identify students at risk for failure, monitor students' progress, which really teachers are doing that with all students, but this is a little bit more intense, a little bit more specific, provide research-based intervention, make changes to the intervention based off the student's progress. So is the intervention working? Okay, great. If it's not, okay, let's look at a different option. And then identify students with learning disabilities. So Christy mentioned this earlier. This is going to be kiddos who might get a pull out, where they're going to be taken out of the classroom for 15, 20 minutes with a small group of kids. I look back on it now in 1st and 2nd grade, I was probably an RTI kid. I was pulled out. My reading was a little bit lower than where it should have been. And I went to a small group and we practiced reading skills. So a pull out, or we sometimes also hear them as push in. So an extra teacher will come in the classroom and pull a small group to the back to do some extra learning or building of skills. So there are different levels of RTI. It's a tiered system. So as you go down the tiers from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, it's going to get more intense, right? So maybe they're going to be pulled out more frequently or for longer periods of time. But again, it's all intervention that's supposed to help the student catch up. It's not supposed to be there forever. And it helps us identify kids with learning disabilities, because when we're not seeing progress, that's a red flag for us to go, okay, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe we need more accommodations and modifications. So just know that if you hear a teacher say, oh, they're getting intervention or they're getting RTI, to maybe ask what that RTI is. Is it a push-in? Is it a pull-out? What does it look like? Is the child responding to the intervention? Those are all things to keep track of with your CASA kiddos, to kind of make note of, so you can report it back to the judge and say in 6 months, hey, is that RTI working? How are they doing? Because kids will graduate from RTI. The other thing is ELL. So ELL is that English language learner, which we spoke about earlier, but these are students whose primary language is not English and they need support surrounding learning English. And so they will qualify for ELL classes. Those are also kind of pull-out classes. So those are interventions, different kind of intervention, but an intervention nonetheless, where they'll pull those kids out and they'll work on English language skills. Each school kind of has a different setup, obviously. My school, it was a teacher who was there 2 days a week. And so if you connect with the teacher of your CASA kiddo and they say, oh yeah, the ELL teacher's email is this, you can probably reach out to them and say, how is the kiddo doing? What skills are they learning? That kind of thing. That's good information for you to put in your court report. So moving right along, we kind of already talked about this, so I'm not going to spend too long on it, but the one thing I did want to mention is that we talked about if a kid moves within the state. So what happens if a kid moves from out of state? We sometimes have cases where the family just moved to Kentucky and then the petition is filed, right? Maybe the kid's only been here for a couple of months. So they might have transferred, and if it happens in the middle of summer, then it's going to be even more of a situation where they've moved in the middle of the year, they've come from an out-of-state school. So the new school in Kentucky has to provide services that are comparable to the ones described in the child's IEP from the previous school. So they can't just say, oh, well, they didn't come from a Kentucky school, so we're not going to do anything for a while. Nope, they still have to provide those services. And then starting, I think Cindy said in 2004, but maybe it was more recently. It was more recently. Okay, sorry. Just a couple years ago, then they used to just be able to adopt it, but now they actually do have to reevaluate the child, determine what is kind of necessary for their accommodations, and then implement a new IEP. But in the meantime, they have to be able to kind of provide those comparable services. So that's if a child moves from out of state. Last couple of things, a note on the parents' rights. So we also, again, talked about this a little bit. They must give consent to evaluate and for their child to receive services. They must get prior notice of upcoming meetings and the changes. They have access to academic records. So just know that if your child is placed in foster care or with fictive kin or with family placement, as long as TPR has not occurred, that parent still has the right to their child's academic records. They can call the school and get those. So if you ever have a parent say, oh yeah, I called the school and got their records, and you're like, what? How did they do that? They have a right. They're the parent. Until a termination of parental rights has occurred, this is a right they have as their parent. They have the right to the IEE, that independent education evaluation, if they don't agree with the evaluation that's occurred that I was mentioning earlier. And they have the right to know the procedure of placement changes. And what I mean by placement changes is not foster care or anything like that, but the placement of if the child is not succeeding in the regular classroom and needs to go to that slightly more restrictive environment in the special education classroom, like all day, they have to be notified of that. And we've already talked about this, but what if there is no parent? Then there are surrogate parents that are appointed by the school district. Finally, as a CASA, these are some of the people that I think it would be beneficial for you to sometimes talk to. Not in all cases, but I wanted to make this list, especially because if you haven't had kids in the school system in a really long time, or you've never had kids in the school system, or you've never engaged with the public school system, you might not know that some of these exist. So just kind of let you know that these are people that you might want to talk to. The teachers, both regular and special education, if applicable. So if your child is receiving special education instruction from a special education teacher, which as we talked about, just because they have an IEP doesn't mean they're working with a special education teacher. But if they are, I would recommend talking to both teachers. A case manager for the IEP. This is not something that we really have brought up yet, but every kiddo who has an IEP has a case manager. Now, I was talking to Cindy about this the other day because, fun fact, even as a teacher, I didn't know this. Partially, that's because I was working in the elementary school, and we were talking about the fact that in the elementary school, the case manager is usually the special education teacher, right? It's someone who's there to monitor the progress, report to the teacher or to the parents. They're the point of contact on everything IEP. And I had never really thought about it because I always knew that was our special education teacher. But when a kid moves to middle school and they have all those different classes, or high school, they have all those different classes, they might have a bunch of different special education teachers. There might be one special education teacher for math and another special education teacher for reading. So that is where it makes sense to have one case manager for each child who has an IEP. So if your CASA child has an IEP, it might be worth it to call the school and say, hey, I was wondering who their IEP case manager is. And if a parent ever asks you like a question about the child's IEP, obviously you can just refer them to the school, but more specifically, you could say, I think you should call the case manager, right? We don't really answer questions that we are not in our purview, and we're not educators when we are in the CASA role. And so that might be just a good person to point them in the direction to. School counselors, social workers, especially in Fayette County Public Schools now, I know I can speak to the fact that there are a lot of social workers in the schools that play a different role than the school counselor. So there's kind of both individuals. The school family resource center coordinator. So if you're not familiar with this, family resource centers are centers where they provide a wide range of resources to families. So that could be food, food bag, it could be clothing, it could be kind of connections for parents for employment things. They have a wide range of services. So if you know that your CASA children might be engaging with the Family Resource Center, you might want to contact them. The school psychologist can be helpful, especially if you're trying to understand evaluations from an IEP or get IEP information. An RTI interventionist. So again, if the child is getting RTI services and the teacher mentions, oh yeah, the interventionist comes and pulls them out, you might say, oh, who's the interventionist? And you could talk to that interventionist specifically and see how they're doing in RTI. ELL teacher, same thing if they're an ELL, and then speech therapist if they're there as well, and are being used. Last couple of things, ways to advocate. So these are just very general ways to advocate. Because every case is so specific and so unique. I don't like to get into the nitty-gritty here. If you have specific case questions, I highly encourage you to reach out to your VM. We're all in the same office for the most part. They know where to find me. If they have questions, I can get them to my mother-in-law, that kind of thing. You can also always reach out to me. But overarching, make recommendations based on learning from the ARC team, right? Attend ARC meetings to keep up to date on the child's IEP. Advocate for a referral. And when I say advocate for a referral, I don't mean call the school and get a referral. I mean advocate for one of your reports. Or calling our ARC meeting if needed. Your recommendation might be the child needs to have an ARC meeting because maybe they've already met their annual goals or maybe they're behind. And that would be information that would come from the sorry, I lost my train of thought. That would be information that would come from the educators. Ask for progress reports and update the judge with IEP goals that are being met and making progress, right? That would be in that child evaluation section. Outside of the court report, if for some reason you're at pretrial and you're not writing a court report, or if you are post-TPR and you're not going to court as frequently, for whatever reason, the other ways that you can kind of advocate outside of a court report is follow up with the parents. Follow up with the parent is engaging with the case manager or the school. So, right, so you could ask the parents, hey, have you talked to the school? Or see if the school has talked to the parent, right? We're not going to tell the parent what to do. That's not our role, but we can always see if they are engaging. And if the parent has questions about their, brings up, hey, I don't know what's going on with my child's school. Tell them, hey, you should probably contact the school then. I can't give you those answers, call the school. See if there are services that the family needs that you can inform the social worker of. So that could be things like if the parent's like, I really want to call another IEP meeting, but I don't know how. You can tell them to call the school, or you can tell them to call the social worker, and you can relay that information to the social worker, and they might be able to kind of help the school reconnect. And then follow up on the student's IEP and ARC meetings, especially if the child is transient. So if the child is moving around a lot, it's fair for you to call the school and say, hey, I'm, here's my court order. How's such and such doing? How is Bobby in class? How's Bobby's behaviors? Has Bobby's IEP been implemented, right? And see if it has. Or if you know that the annual ARC meeting is coming up, reaching out and saying, hey, I was wondering if there's a date for the ARC meeting, kind of staying on top of that kind of thing. So sorry, we did run a little bit over. You guys had some really good questions and I wanted to make sure you guys got all of this information. But with all that to be said, I'm not gonna be able to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. There we are. Did anyone have any questions that I could answer? Otherwise, I won't keep you guys any longer, but you know that you can always reach out to me. I will send out an email with the PowerPoint and everything, and you can always respond to that email. But for now, is there anyone that has any questions that I can answer?
Yeah, I have one, Liz.
Yeah.
How to participate in an ARC meeting. I didn't know we could, first of all, so that's great news. Mm-hmm. Who is the person that we should contact at the school to seek that participation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it can be a couple different people. I think just for ease, the recommendation I would have is to probably reach out to the regular teacher first, either that or the school counselor, and just provide them with your court order and say, I was, wondering if the child has an IEP, and if they do, when the next ARC meeting is. That would be what I would do. And obviously, if you ever kind of meet any sort of pushback, you can always connect with your VM and they can kind of help you navigate that. But in general, CASAs are able to attend ARC meetings. Sometimes people just don't realize that we're there, or, in certain cases, the the people who are putting the meeting together, right, like the ARC chair, don't realize that there's a CASA tied to that kiddo. So that's when I would probably reach out sooner and see if they have an IEP. And if they do, say, you know, when is the next ARC meeting? And then I check in. I mean, I would recommend checking in with the teacher. Our teachers are really busy, just kind of like our social workers. And so I think it really depends on if your child has academic concerns. I'd be reaching out more frequently, right? Or school concerns in general, not necessarily even academic, but behavior or speech or whatever they may be. I'd be reaching out more frequently, and I just kind of always kind of check out and check in. And when I check in, I would say something like, hey, how's the child doing? Are they receiving intervention services? Has there been a referral for an IEP? And just kind of continue to ask, because at some point, if an IEP isn't in place but would become in place, then that's when they would answer and say, oh yeah, and a referral was made for an IEP. And then that's when you could say, okay, when is the next meeting, or when is the IEP meeting or the ARC meeting? Does that kind of answer the question, Julie?
Yeah, thank you so much. Now they do have the ARC meetings for the 504s as well, right?
Yeah, so they're not called, or they may are called ARC meetings. I don't know if Cindy might be.
I had Jessamine County, and that's the records that I got, because I didn't know I could participate in that case.
So I think they may be called ARC meetings in Jessamine County, but not another. I'm not 100% sure, but yes, you could definitely ask them the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, they would not be an ARC meeting. It's a 504 meeting.
Okay, it's a 504 meeting.
Okay.
So you could ask.
There's usually chair 504 meetings, I think, in Jessamine County, at least it used to be, that the counselors at the school would chair the 504 meetings.
Okay, so the counselor would be the person to reach out to in that situation.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Liz, also, if there's a child with a 504 meeting, there will be usually a medical representative, such as the school nurse. So if your child has a 504, that is medically related in a different sense. Maybe that child has asthma, they'll have to carry around an inhaler with them. If they're diabetic, they may have access to snacks and, insulin. If they are a heart patient, there would be accommodations in place, such as there will be an AED on the premises, there will be an emergency plan for that. So when you guys have medical children, those plans may look a little different, and there should always be a nurse in on those meetings.
Good point. Thank you, Christy. Yes. So kind of in the same vein, Christy, and because she made this point, I'll just like broaden it, which is that kind of relates back to, and I didn't even bring up the nurse, so thank you so much for that, that if the child is getting those services through someone at the school, then the school should be at that meeting. So then this person from the school should be at that meeting. So if their IEP is related to medical stuff, then the nurse should be there. If their IEP or 504 is related to speech, then the speech pathologist should be there. So I used speech as the example, but it goes the same way with the school nurse. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, I will let you guys go for the day then. But thank you so much for hopping on and spending your evening with us. You will get an hour and 45 minutes worth of time for being on here. And I appreciate you kind of hanging out with us. Like I said, I'm going to send out an email with a feedback form first thing tomorrow. If you guys don't mind filling that out, that will let me know what worked and didn't work with this training. That way, if we were to do it again or expand it, I know what to fix with my